nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payo Rasho Murake Dato Vande Bhagavatani Mananulavam Murdna Nipatyakshito Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tishe Nama Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Kuladi Devatamar Madana Mohan Jar Seva Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Vandan Jahaite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Adadana-strinam dantair yacheham puna puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhulisyam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Vilashati Balashvavara Shri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdanta Churastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shiradhaya Sahasara Smaratam Vrajendhum Shri Rupa Chintamala Shri Rupa Parakamala Shrittapadam Chittam Satamam Madhukariyatu pada padme Yaramya Nikilaga Shanga Shamani Sutratritim Sangata Yasadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hridaye Muk Brajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yad Hari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. So by the grace of Shri Kali-yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Maha Sagar, Shri Gauranga Maha Prabhu, and his beloved Parshad, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava Charjas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire in this world. Again, today we'll absorb ourselves in discussion of Padyavali. And we begin a new prakaranam, the prakaran of Dhyan upon Krishna. So we introduced it at the end of the last class, so we'll just jump straight in. Next, in expectation of an inquiry from readers about the appearance of Sri Krishna's figure, now that they have heard about the greatness of his person in general, the greatness of his name, the greatness of discussion of him, and other related subjects, the compiler begins a section on meditation. That is, he presents a series of verses that serve as guides for meditation upon Sri Krishna's figure, for worshippers who foster affinity for various bhavas in relation to him. So, there's the topic of meditation upon the figure of Bhagavan, or the figure of Krishna, and then there is also specificity about how that figure is meditated upon. In other words, in what context is he situated, in the company of whom is he present, in what spirit, in what manner of expression or activity is he poised. All of these things are given great attention to by the great Bhakta Kavis. so that their descriptions can nourish the aspirations of various bhaktas who aspire to have particular forms of relational attitude and exchanges of love with Bhagavan. So we see that there are descriptions that are general, in other words, that speak of general characteristics that may be objects of meditation for many. And then there are descriptions that will describe him in a specific manner that will be suitable only to aspirants of a particular type of attachment to him. So in this section, Rupa Goswami cites both general and specific verses for meditation. So we'll look here at the first, which is perhaps the most well-known of those that are here. Phullendīvara-kāntim indu-vadanaṁ barhāvataṁsa-priyaṁ śrīvatsāṅkam udāra-kaustubha-dharaṁ pītāmbaraṁ sundaram gopīnāṁ nayanotpalārcita-tanuṁ go-gopa-saṅghāvṛtaṁ govindaṁ kala-veṇu-vādana-paraṁ divyāṅga-bhūṣaṁ bhaje. Blossoming blue lotus luster, a moon face, a pleasing peacock-feather crest atop his crown, marked with the Śrīvatsa, wearing the charming kaustubha, clad in yellow garments, beautiful, his figure worshipped by the blue lotuses of the gopīs' eyes, surrounded by a drove of cows and cowherds, sublime as he is engaged in softly playing the flute, his limbs adorned with splendid ornaments. Upon Govinda I meditate. So just for reference, I've given the translation here in a manner that corresponds to the exact sequence of descriptions given in the verse, with the only exception that the mention of Govinda is moved to the penultimate position. But otherwise, as you read it in the English, is the same as the points of description that come out in the verse itself. So the idea being that this is a verse which is to be memorized, and then as each of these phrases are, recited or brought to mind, then one performs a visualization or a meditation upon those features of Krishna's appearance. So let's look at some of the significance of some of the descriptions that are given. Sri Krishna is said to have a moon face because of his face being delighting in a manner similar to that of the moon. The Śrīvatsa is a small lock of fine, white, right curling hair on the upper right breast of Sri Bhagavan. So this is found both on Bhagavan Narayan as well as Bhagavan Krishna. So a little bit like what we might call a birthmark, somewhat unusual or a unique characteristic on the body that's unlike any other. A small lock of fine white right curling hair on the upper right breast of Bhagavan. So on the upper right of his chest, there's a small little growth of white hair. The kaustubha jewel is a ruby with the hue of a reddish lotus. So we hear many things about Bhagavan or Narayan wearing this kaustubha. So what does it actually look like? So it's said to look like a ruby and to have a color like a red lotus. And Bhagavan is said to wear it over his chest. Sorry, someone is calling me out of the blue here. Okay. So a little history on the kaustubha. The kaustubha jewel is said to have emerged during the churning of the ocean by the devas and asuras. The name kaustubha literally means that which comes from the ocean, or kaustubha. So one word for ocean is kaustubha, and that word literally means that which pervades the earth. So ku is said to be a word for the earth, and stub, a dhatu, meaning to fill or pervade or to cover the earth. So the ocean is that which fills or covers the earth. So it's called kaustubha. And this thing, because it came out from the kaustubha, became known as the kaustubha. So kaustubha, this elongation of the vowel at the beginning, is an indication of something that's derivative from something else. So it simply means the jewel that came out of the ocean. After the kaustubha jewel was desired and donned as an ornament by Bhagavan Vishnu upon emerging from the ocean, it became the principal ornament worn by Bhagavan on his chest. So it was in the middle of the churning of the ocean that the elephant Airavata came out and was given to Indra, and Lakshmi appeared and was married to Narayan, and this kaustubha came out and was taken by Narayan, and the Surabhi came out and was taken by Brahma, and so on and so forth. So many various wonderful elements emerged prior to the emergence of Amrita. So in the course of that, the kaustubha arose and it was accepted by Vishnu. So in that way, this reddish lotus, which is, ruby, which appears like the color of a reddish lotus, came and became worn by Bhagavan Vishnu. When Bhagavan first appeared to Devaki and Vasudev in a four-armed Vishnu form, he was wearing the kaustubha. But when he transformed into a two-armed baby form of Sri Krishna, the jewel disappeared. At that time, the jewel was invisibly transferred to the treasury of the serpent Kaliya. And later, after Sri Krishna subdued Kaliya, the serpent's wives offered Sri Krishna the kaustubha along with other fine jewels, not knowing that the kaustubha actually belonged to Bhagavan himself. Thereafter, Sri Krishna would regularly wear the jewel and was adored by the gopis for doing so. So in other words, in places in the Bhagavat and elsewhere, when the gopis think of Krishna or praise Krishna's appearance, then they praise or they mention his kaustubha jewel. They find that an endearing feature of his appearance. So this is how it's both his and also was acquired by him. So in other words, his chest has this reddish jewel in the middle and a small lock of white hair in the upper right portion. The jewel is said to be as radiant as crores of suns and to represent the jivas. So a few statements to this effect. Here in the Vishnu Puran it says, Bhagavan Hari carries on his chest the detached, qualityless, untainted self of the universe, that is, the embodied jiva, the pure knower of the field, in the form of the kaustubha jewel. And also in the Bhagavatam, we find a statement to this effect. The unborn Lord bears on his chest the light of his own self, that is, the pure consciousness of the jivas, by means of the representation, or form, of the kaustubha and the śrīvatsa itself, which is possessed of the pervading effulgence thereof. So these are interesting points. They show that Bhagavan holds the jivas dear to him. So Chakravarti Pad comments to this effect, saying, Sri Chakravarti Pad comments in this regard that Sri Bhagavan thus carries his own servants, the jivas, on his heart, which is in accord with Srimad Bhagavatam's description of Sri Bhagavan's being he who possesses bhakti for his bhaktas, Bhagavan, tad bhakta bhaktiman, and Sri Bhagavan's own declaration of this to Durvasa. That is, the sadhus are my heart, and I am the heart of the sadhus. The commentator states in the verse under discussion, I think I needed that the Kaustubha jewel is described as, quote, charming, udāra, even though the Kaustubha is always charming by nature, because it shines with superlative sweetness when on the chest of Sri Krishna in Braja. That is, when it is worn by the complete most or purnatama manifestation of Sri Bhagavan. So he's kicking one in here. In other words, if the Kaustubha is said to be charming, then does that just describe the Kaustubha's nature in general? Or does that mean that in this case of it being worn by Krishna, it's charming? So he takes it in the second option and says that this indicates the superiority of even Krishna's beauty to that of Narayan. So this is alluded to also in the Krishna Bhavanamrita, where in the course of some of the parrots of Braja singing in praise of Krishna, this following is said: "Did your abounding anurag itself, not having sufficient space internally within your heart, become visible externally in the guise of the Kaustubha worn on your chest, defaming of hundreds of risen moons and suns, by which the world has become reddened, or illuminated, or delighted, or endeared to you?" So this is a poetic play on words. The word anurag or rag can mean redness, and it can also mean priti, prema, love, etc. So there's often poetic interplay between red and love, or reddening and being in love, or acting under the influence of love. So because the Kaustubha is red, or it's the color of a red lotus, of ruby, then this idea is being drawn out, that if Krishna is wearing this bright, extremely bright red jewel on his chest, which is more lustrous than hundreds of moons and suns, and it's as if the glow of this red jewel is making everything around him reddened, or it's casting a reddening light, or it's illuminating or delighting or endearing everyone around him by its brightness, by its allure, then why is that? Is it that you had so much love in your heart that there wasn't any place to keep it? It had to come out, and therefore it adopted the form of this jewel? So this is, furthering the idea. In other words, if Chakravarti Pad is saying in this earlier comment that he holds his bhaktas over his heart, or he holds these, those who, just that he is he who has bhakti for his bhaktas, and to represent that, or to show how he cherishes his bhaktas, he wears this necklace that represents them over his heart all the time. Just as in the world, especially maybe not as much in the present day, but in the past, people would wear love lockets with a little picture or some little memento of whom they love, and wear that over their heart or around their neck as a way of always being reminded of whom they love. Then it's as though Bhagavan is wearing this jewel over his heart to bear remembrance of all his bhaktas whom he loves. So that jewel is also so bright, that jewel also shines in such an endearing and, quote, reddening manner, that it's as if, or to praise Krishna, they're saying it's as if all the love in his heart is now coming out and shining, just as this jewel shines from his chest. So in that way, we see how some of the acharyas have spoken about the topic of the Kaustubha. Now, I'm not commenting on every phrase in this verse, because it would become long, and some of the points in it have been mentioned earlier, some will also be discussed later, so I'm just touching on those that the commentator gave attention to, or that seem to specifically require attention. So one of them is this word sundaram, or beautiful, which from a literary perspective you could say is a little bit disappointing. In other words, one of the main principles of kavya is not to just say what something is, but to show what it is in such a way that a great impression of it is made. So just to say, Krishna is beautiful. This doesn't really do anything for us. But to say that he wears a jewel that illuminates everything around him, and that's an expression of all the love that he has in his heart, then you don't have to say he's beautiful. We already know that, or we come to acquire that impression, or we automatically, are filled with that sentiment just by hearing the first description. So if in a poem of this type of caliber, this type of description is being made, then there has to be some further meaning to it. If we just to say like, oh, he's this and this, and he's beautiful, then it can almost seem like a literary fault. So to prevent that, then we should understand that the word beautiful, when used in Sanskrit, and as per Rupa Goswami's viewpoint, isn't just sort of a generic word the way it is in English, but it has a specified sense, which he mentions multiple times in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, and also in further detail in the Ujjal Nilamani. So I refer to that here. Regarding the mention of Sri Krishna's being, quote, beautiful, sundaram, the compiler defines and describes beauty in his Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu as follows. Quote, formation, as is felicitous, of the limbs and sublimbs of the body, shall be called beauty, or sundarya, as is described in the following verse. Quote, your face with wide eyes, chest firm like a swath of emerald, 2 arms like pillars of light, flanks finely ridged, midsection lean, and loins captivating with burgeoning waves of sweetness. O enemy of Kamsa, the heart of which lady of lotus eyes do these not attract? So this is a reference specifically to the gopis, meaning that when they see all of these features of Krishna's beauty, then their hearts are attracted to him. So, in this regard, specifically the definition of beauty is given here as formation as is felicitous. So, yato chitam can mean as is pleasing or as is appropriate, and he cites also this statement in the Ujjal Nilamani and Vishnu Chakravarti Pad. There he adds some detail in the Tika, saying that the quote, as is felicitous, means that each of the limbs and the sublimbs of the body, meaning the arm, and specifically the forearm, the upper arm, the wrist, the joints at the elbow, he goes into all these details. It would be like the face, as well as the cheeks, the ears, the eyes, the parts or the limbs, and then the subparts therein, that all of them have an apt degree of thickness where thickness is desired, an apt degree of thinness where thinness is desired, an apt degree of curvature where curvature is desired, and so on and so forth. And each of the joints have a certain degree of tension in the flesh, which is considered ideal. And they get into all these kind of details. So the idea being that beauty is something more specifically defined than the way we might use it in English as just something that looks nice, but rather refers specifically to the constitution of the figure of something. So that's in contrast to something else, what is also discussed in these texts, such as lavanya, or what sometimes it's translated as loveliness, which refers to how then light reflects or plays off of something, or the brightness that comes from a figure. That has another word and another term for it. So in English, you might call either one of those things beautiful, but to be specific, then they say that the actual construction or formation of the parts of something, when that is ideal, that we call one thing, and then when a wonderful sort of glow or play of light occurs or brightness is radiated from that, then that's another quality. So these things are explained elsewhere by Rupa Goswami, but I've just mentioned them. So to say, when he's mentioning here that Krishna appears beautiful, then he's referring to it. It has that specified sense. And I just want to add, I don't know if I'll put it in the text, maybe I'll add it later, but one point of reference at this stage, because we still have a little ways to go before we get into a lot of the specifically Krishna-related poetry that comes and is the majority of what we find in the Padyavali. Here, we're beginning with direct description of Krishna, and we're seeing these analogies being given. He has blue lotus-like luster. So, in this regard, Jiva Gosvami, in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, when Rupa Goswami first makes mention of these type of descriptions, or when, in other words, he compares Krishna to anything, meaning something that is in the realm of perception. Because to make a comparison that's appropriate according to the rules of literature, the thing to wit, the object of comparison, or what's being used as a standard of comparison, such as a lotus, when you say Krishna's eyes are like a lotus, the audience for whom you're writing your poem has to know what a lotus is for what you're saying to have any meaning. In other words, if you compare something to something else that the audience has no conception of, there's nothing to gain from making such a comparison. So comparisons are, by definition, something that are part of the existing frame of reference of the audience. But in the case of trying to describe Krishna using comparison, you run into a problem because the frame of reference is the world, or the frame of reference is only the lotuses and the suns and the color red and these things that we've seen in this world. And Krishna is by nature not of this world. So as soon as you compare him to something of this world, when his nature is not of this world, then you in one sense misguide, or you in one sense misguide your audience or misrepresent the nature of Krishna. Or do you? In other words, how is it that all of these poets, who are known to be wise and known to not have any intent and to have come from hundreds of years of tradition of such practice going on, how is it that this is not a misguided or a misdirected pursuit? Then Jiva Goswami has a few points to share about that in the Sindhu, so I'd like to add those here. He makes the first of them on the very first verse of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, and then he mentions it again where the first quality of Krishna is described in the beginning of the second section of the Sindhu. So, in other words, when you come to the technical point where the Vishwayavalambana Vibhava is being explained, in other words, where you're going to now explain what are Krishna's qualities, then in reference to that very first quality, he again brings this topic of discussion. And the verse that I've quoted here in the commentary about beauty, that verse is said to be a repetition or a slightly elaborated expression of the same point that's made in regard to Krishna's very first quality. So he refers to that also in the commentary. So in other words, from this description in the verse we're talking about in Padyavali, you have mention of beauty. Then you have this definition of beauty in the Sindhu. That definition of beauty in the Sindhu is based on an earlier definition of beauty that was given earlier on. And in reference specifically to that earlier definition, Jiva Goswami makes a point which he also says he made in the very first verse of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. So, I hope that's not too much background detail, but following this line of thought, I'm just going to share, I don't have it in the text yet, but I may add it later, these two comments of Jiva Goswami. So the first is from the Durgama Sangamani on the first verse of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, where he says, Sarva lokikati tepi, tasmin lokikarta visheshopama dvara, lokanam buddhi pravesha syat, iti kenapi angshena upameyam. that people's intellect can have some limited entrance into that, meaning the subject matter of Sri Krishna, Bhakti Rasa, and so forth, what this text is about, even though it is beyond everything of the world, through comparisons made with particular objects. So he's saying that even though Krishna is beyond this world, people's understanding or their intellect can get some entrance into that using these comparisons. So he's not saying, oh, how dare you compare Krishna to anything of the world, he's beyond the world. He's saying that it is possible to get some entrance. Thus, it is comparable in, quote, some respect. In other words, things of the world can be compared to particular aspects of Krishna as required to convey general knowledge of those aspects of his nature. So in other words, don't think that now you know what Krishna looks like exactly, but just think that this is giving your understanding some entrance into that. It's pointing to that. It's alluding to what it actually is, but it's not giving you full knowledge. So don't think that it's useless, but don't think that it's complete either. This is the balance that he wants the reader to understand. Now in the second point, he elaborates on that as follows. Yadyapi purvanasarena chandradayas tasya drishtantata leshamapi naharati. Tatapi sadarana lokanam tadvara tanmohima praveshartam eva te drishtantitaha. He says, although, in accord with the former comment, which is the one that I just read, the moon and so forth are not fit, even in the least, to be objects of comparison with him. So, although the general understanding is you can't compare Krishna to lotuses and the moon and things like that in the world, because he's not of the world and they're of the world. So they're not appropriate. He says, although that is the case, still they are cited as objects of comparison with him. Still they do it, even though it's not appropriate. Why? For the purpose of common people's entering into his greatness thereby. In other words, he uses the same phrase, pravesh, that there's some entrance or there's some degree of understanding into how great he is by saying that. It's not complete, but it's not considered to be detrimental or entirely ineffective either. It's a marginal or a partial degree of beginning to understand. Then he says, Yatra tu tadantaranga parikarerapi tadrisham varnyate tatra sakshat bhagavad vibhuti rup tad lila parikara eva chandradayo drishtantita iti sarvatra gyayam. Where, however, such objects of comparison are described even by his intimate retinue, there only the moon and so forth that are directly part of the retinue in his lila, in the form of Bhagavan's splendors or vibhutis, are cited as objects of comparison with him. This is to be understood in all cases. And he says, but it also depends on who's making the comparison. Suppose the gopis are talking about Krishna, just as we find in the Venu Gita and the Yugal Gita and so on. And in places like that, they compare Krishna's face to the moon or his eyes to lotuses. Then when those persons, when those members of his divine realm compare the lotuses and the moon of their experience, in other words, the lotuses of that divine realm, the moon of that divine realm, to his eyes, his face, and so on, then that should be understood to be such. In other words, that they're not comparing Krishna to the moon that you've seen in this world, they're comparing Krishna to the moon that they see in that world. So, if we read poetry that's described or said to have been authored by such parikaras of Bhagavan, then they're not even talking about the lotuses or the moon of this world anyway in the first place. This is he says, sarvatra geyam. This is to be understood in all cases. In other words, this is a pervading frame of reference to understand. And if I may, I don't want to belabor the point too much, but Chakravartipad, he also elaborates on this same idea slightly in his commentary. He repeats the same thing that Jiva Gosvami said, and then he adds a little bit to what the second sentence that I read, as follows. Yatra tu Shri Krishna svatasiddha chitta praveshavanti Shri Radha Chandravali Adibhirapi Chandradikam Drishtanti Kritya Shri Krishna Varnyate Tatra Krishna Lila Parikara Aprakritas Chandradaya Eva Tabir Drishtani Krita Iti Sarvatra Geyam. That where, however, Shri Krishna is described by making the moon and so forth objects of comparison, even by Shri Radha, Chandravali, and others, there only the moon and so forth that are part of the retinue of Krishna's Leela and supramundane are made objects of comparison by them. So he just says it a little bit more clearly. Anyway, that's just something that's useful for us as we go here further on in the Padyavali, and we'll encounter so many cases where this type of metaphoric discussion is made. Then this is something to be borne in mind as we go through. So when Krishna's eyes are compared, or his luster, his face, and so on are compared in all these ways, then they're compared to the moon, the lotuses, etc. of Braja, or of that, divine land of his Leela, not directly to the things of this world, which all have certain spots or faults or various things. There's a famous, I don't remember how it goes, but there's a famous verse of Hanuman where he says, Oh Ram, how can I compare your face to the moon? The moon has a big black spot in it, but your face is impeccable. So there are also, points that emphasize the distinction between Bhagavan and anything of this world. So these points are to be borne in mind as these descriptions are made. Okay, now let's move on. And here, the commentator has one of his most interesting comments that's come so far, in my opinion, and certainly the most interesting on this verse. He goes as follows. The description, quote, his figure worshipped by the blue lotuses of the gopis' eyes, gopīnāṁ nayanotpalārcita-tanuṁ, is a description of the specialty of Sri Krishna's companions, by means of which the specialty of his figure being meditated upon in the verse under discussion is conveyed. The comparison of the gopis' eyes to blue lotuses alludes to their softness and loveliness. And by mention of Sri Krishna's being, worshipped by the gopis' eyes, it is conveyed that the gopis have thus offered their eyes to him. Okay? So when you perform worship, you, let's say, offer flowers. If you pick a lotus and you offer the lotus, then you place the lotus there at the feet of Krishna, let's say. So the lotus was in your possession, it was in your hands, and then it's been put down, and it's put at the feet of Krishna, and it's understood that there's a transfer of ownership. It's now Krishna's lotus. It's not your lotus anymore. It's yours in the sense that you were the one who offered it, but it's now Krishna's right to do whatever he likes with that lotus. You no longer have the right to do anything else with that lotus. It's gone out of your jurisdiction by doing that. So this verse is saying that the gopis' eyes are like lotuses, and those lotuses are worshipping Krishna, which is to say that they're being given to Krishna. So the commentator, he elaborates on this point. So he says, since one retains no ownership over an object that one has offered to Sri Bhagavan, and thus one retains no right to repossess that object, it is to be understood that the gopis only continue to retain their eyes after their having offered them to Krishna, as an expression of love for him, in a manner akin to wearing nirmalya, that is, adoringly wearing a garland that has been offered and worn by Krishna, and then received back from him as his prasad. So you could object, and others say, if the gopis offered their eyes, then why did they walk away and keep them? How is it that they're acting as if their eyes still belong to them, if it is said that they've worshipped Krishna with them? So he's saying that yes, they have worshipped Krishna with them, and just as people may go to the temple, they may offer fruits, or offer a garland, or offer tulasi, or what have you, and then after that is offered, then it may be given back to them as prasad. And it's understood that if the pujari gives this back, then it's taken that this is the will of the Thakur. The Thakur has extended this back as his grace upon the worshipper, as his reciprocal gesture of affection. So we should understand that if the gopis have worshipped Krishna with the lotuses of their eyes, then Krishna has accepted that, and he's as though returned them back so that they can, quote-unquote, wear them or use them as his prasad, just as one might wear a garland that has been worn by the devata. In this regard, however, an objection may arise that the eyes of the gopis are known to be naturally flickering. So that, we'll get to later here in the Padyavali and in various other poems, Radharani's eyes are sometimes compared to wagtail birds. In other words, they're always flickering. They never seem to be still. They're as if restless. So, if the gopis' eyes are known to be naturally flickering, and thus, after having offered them to Krishna, they are bound to cast them toward another object, and then again cast them back towards Krishna again, as an offering of worship, this is inappropriate, because it is forbidden to perform worship with an article that has already been offered. So once you offer something and you receive it back as the prasad, you can't offer the prasad again to the deity again. You have to offer something fresh. You can't offer the remnants back to the person. That's not accepted in the rules of worship. So if they offered their eyes, Krishna gave back their eyes, and then they're having their flickering glances, looking away, and then looking back at Krishna again, and if they're again and again doing this, then they're again and again worshipping him with their eyes. They're again and again giving him what's already been offered. But everyone knows you can't give what's already been offered. So this is inappropriate. To this, the commentator says that while it's true, in general, that worship should not be offered with any article that has already been offered before, still there is no fault in the case of the gopis repeatedly worshipping Sri Krishna with their eyes, because performance of repeated puja with flowers made of special substances such as jewels is sanctioned. So you can only offer flowers once, but if the flowers are made of gold or the flowers are made of special jewels, then they're considered reusable, just as cloth or, flutes or ornaments, earrings and necklaces. These things can be offered multiple times. It's not that you can offer a gold necklace to Krishna and then after he wears it one day, it can never be offered again. You can offer it to him again the next day. He can wear a crown again and again. When things are made of non-perishable substances or fine substances, then everyone knows it's okay to offer them repeatedly. So he's saying the gopis' eyes aren't just like flowers, even though they've been compared to flowers here. Even though they've been compared to the flowers, they should be considered in this case to fall into the category of jewels, or to fall into the category of things that can be offered repeatedly. So the commentator knows very well that the intent of the poet is not to necessarily take this statement so literally, but he's playfully taking this statement literally in order to draw out some charm from what is said. Okay, and then a couple other points. When it says kala-veṇu-vādana-paraṁ, or sublime as he is engaged in softly playing the flute, indicates that his flute playing is sweet and indistinct, such that upon hearing it, it is difficult to identify, and one wonders, is this a flowing stream of nectar, or the song of a kinnari? So the word kala-veṇu-vādanaṁ, that it doesn't just say that he's playing the flute, saying that he's playing it softly, or it's as if Krishna is being seen in this meditation something a bit from a distance, and so the sound of the flute that can be heard in this case is slightly indistinct, and yet it's extremely alluring, it's extremely satisfying. So someone upon hearing it might think or feel as if the waves of sound entering their ears are comparable to a stream of nectar, and flowing over their tongue, and they might think, oh, is this something divine? To say a kinnari, or which is like equivalent loosely to a Gandharva, those who, in the context of the human-like Braja Leela, are considered to be these celestial, wonderful musicians, then it's as if one of these, amazing celestial, the sound of something that's, otherworldly is wafting through the air. Something like that is meant to be conveyed. So he's softly playing this flute, and he's, sublime, or he appears, so exalted in doing so. Or you could also interpret it to mean he's absorbed in playing in that way, but this is how the commentator read it. Finally, regarding, quote, limbs adorned with splendid ornaments, divyāṅga-bhūṣaṁ, the ornaments he wears on his body are said to be splendid because of their shining amidst his limbs by virtue of their being constituted of consciousness. So everything about Bhagavan's figure, as well as his ornaments, is all spiritual in nature. It's all conscious in nature, so it's understood to have a certain lightness or a certain luster to it. So that is the sense of, quote, divya. Sometimes people take divya as divine, and that's true, but, and those words are cognate from English and Sanskrit and other languages, but the actual root div, or this idea of divinity, is rooted in an idea of something that shines. That's one of the meanings of the div dhatu. So in this context, it's that aspect of, quote, divyata, or divinity of shining, that's being alluded to. So to say that he has divya ornaments is to say that he has shining ornaments. So he's saying that these wonderfully shining ornaments are such because they're not just metals, but they're also constituted of spiritual substance. All right, well, let's leave it at that for today. This one is the most elaborate one of the section, so we can hear the remaining meditations in the next reading. So I'll pause here. If anyone has any comment or question, correction, what have you, feel free.
Yes, of course. How can you stop talking? Oh my God, this is like how. But I don't understand how we can even compare to an offering of the eyes of gopis over again and being offering prasadam, because you don't when they offer the eyes, it's not they offer physical eye or whatever object, they offer the raga through the eyes, and just like you offer when you wave chamara at the front of the Lord in Thakur, you use the same chamara every single day, but do you offer chamara? No, you offer air that flows on his body through chamara. So similarly, they offer the eyes. They don't offer the eyes, they offer the raga that flows from their eyes, the love, over again. And that's acceptable. That's my
Yes, certainly. And as I said, I think the commentator was being a bit playful in this case.
Yes. I understand. I'm just trying to be more playful to it. Like, trying to dive in. It's amazing. So when this kaustubha, it reflects the redness of passionate love of his bhaktas, or
For them.
Sorry, for them. Okay. Reflects the same passion that they have for him. That's why the color red is.
Well, that wasn't literally said.
No?
You might, I mean, you could think that if you wanted, but what was said in the verse was that his love is showing out or shining in the form of the jewel.
Okay. All right. I understand. Now the other parts in I'm not talking about this particular verses and descriptions you brought it, but I think we had something like some discussion of Krishna's ornaments and his dress and everything that he wears. That was during his wives of Brahmanas. They offer prayers to him and how they perceived him, and he was described in a way that every little ornament, every little fold of his cloth, anything that that is on him, expresses a certain type of purpose, a certain type of art, a certain type of. There's a meaning to every. Like you were reading this, the proportion of his body, the curves in the right place, the thinness is properly placed, the wideness. It's just everything has a purpose, and a meaning to it. Not just purpose, a meaning. And so I remember we were reading this description of Krishna, and there was a question: is there any place where you can find the meaning behind every Krishna's ornament? What do they mean? What do they actually say? Why I'm asking this question? Because in Sanatana Shiksha, there's description of Krishna's, for example, Krishna's nails that play the flute, and because in the way how they dance on the flute creates the music that flute plays. And his toenails are also like little moons that dance on the ground independently, and they sing, and their singing inspires jingle bells on his ankle bells to sound. So just like this description of the toenails and nails, is there more like specifically description, maybe reference where you can find descriptions of every little Krishna's body, like we are reading now? But is there more explanation of meaning of behind every single detail of his body and his ornaments? Is there any place where you can find this?
I don't know of any. It depends exactly. I mean, the Krishna Ganodesh Dipika has an overview of all of his principal ornaments. And it gives a particular name for many of them and some details about them. But as far as what you might call ashvadan, or some sort of special way in which their beauty or their qualities are relished in the view of a particular bhakta, I don't know of any place where there's an encyclopedic collection of simply that, but all over the place in 10th canto commentaries and other works of the Goswamis, you can find these type of things. Like in this case of the kaustubha, I pulled from 3-4 places to put together some idea about it. So it's out there, but I don't know of an exact place where it's been, all listed at length.
I think I briefly asked Babaji about this, and he said check in 12th canto. He doesn't remember the place where, but it's somewhere in 12th canto. Would you be able to recall where?
Not off the top of my head.
Mm-hmm. 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 Right. Another thing I'm pondering about is that moon comparison, in reference to how can beauty of Krishna can be compared to anything material. But if moon is used primarily, like right from in the source of where the comparison comes from mouth of Radharani, how is it material? Right, so
Yeah, I mean, that was what we just discussed, right?
yeah.
Okay.
I don't recall exactly. Also, the moon is used to compare it. Is moon the samana? Actually, moon is used to in comparison to samana. Not only his face, but everything about Krishna. It's just the moon. Samana reference to moon, as if the moon is a part of his beauty. In sense like extension of his beauty. It's not that the comparison may be made for something else, but it's specifically to the moon. In so many places, so many parts of his body are being compared to the moon, as if the moon is very, very, very unique and very, very important in object to compare to. And then, if this is the case, is this really material? My question is it really material? Right.
Well, no, right? I mean, we just discussed that whole point, that's exactly what Jiva Goswami just said, that the moon he's being compared to is the moon of his divine realm, not the moon of this world. And I mentioned how Hanuman is saying, how can I compare the moon of this world to you when it has this spot in it and all that. So, the ultimate point of all of this is all of these things are expressions of Krishna's prema. Every feature of his figure, every way that he dresses and acts, and all of it is, to be an expression of that. And the purpose of all such discussion, meditation, what have you, is, in the case of persons who don't have that prema, to, acquire desire for it, to acquire some affinity for that, and to deepen the impression that that is a more worthy object of prayer and aspiration than anything else is. And Chakravarti Pad, in his commentary on the Shruti Stuti early on, he also mentions that Bhagavan or Brahman is said to be Shastra Yoni. There's a sutra, Shastra Yoni Tvat, that Brahman or Paratattva Bhagavan is that the source of which is Shastra. In other words, the source of knowledge of which is Shastra. So how is it that any of these books with words that are all material and minds that are material, etc., how is that any of this gives us knowledge of Bhagavan or gives us knowledge of that which is not material? So he says, ultimately, the thing that makes Bhagavan Shastra Yoni is simply his grace. That he's, of his own accord, reveals himself to persons who study the Shastra, who meditate upon him as described in the Shastra. The thing that actually creates the connection or results in the person having experience of something that is divine and is him, rather than simply words and ideas that are material. Ultimately, it's just his grace. It's just he bestows that. So, in the broadest sense, that's the whole point of all of this, is to receive his grace in that form, that one will have this anubhav. And all this entire culture of literature and poetry and all of these comparisons and all of that, it's to facilitate that exchange, fundamentally. And so, simply put, he says that therefore there is a purpose, or there is value in a bhakta meditating upon Bhagavan based on these descriptions of him. He says it's not that there's no value to that, it's that that has value because it is a way in which the bhakta cultivates and expresses his longing for Bhagavan. And it's that longing that can induce Bhagavan to grant his grace. So these things have meaning. They are effective, so to speak, in the spiritual practice when done as they're meant to be done. But the thing that ultimately makes them effective is the agency of the Swarup Shakti, the agency of Bhagavan himself. So in that way, we can contextualize our understanding of all this discussion as being a pursuit of Bhagavan's grace by means of fostering, ever greater longing for him as the embodiment of prema, and of every feature of him and his lila and his associates and so forth as being, expressions of that prema. Jiva Gosvami also, he has a verse where he says that in Gopal Champu, I forget, Imo Gauri Shamu, I think is how it starts, I forget how it goes, but where he says that it's as if prema has taken the form of these two figures. One is Swarthi, one is golden, and yet the golden one has, dark blue garments, and the dark blue one has golden garments, and it's as if this one thing, prema, has taken two forms, which is clad in colors which correspond to the forms of the other, and is then, interacting with itself, or expressing its own beauty through this dual, counterbalanced expression. So in that way, we can see that all of this is an expression of Bhagavan's prem, all of this is an expression of the supreme bliss, the ultimate, Ananda is the Visheshya in Jiva Goswami's viewpoint, and that is what is, to foster aspiration, prayer for that, and thereby detachment from all lower things, and thereby correction of all unwanted, things, behavior, thought, etc. This is the whole, purpose of this whole culture and process. So we want to study and read these texts in a way that is, consistent with their purpose. Intellectually, we can bring up so many apparent contradictions or questions, or go off on this tangent or that tangent, or like a million things. So, we want to engage in it as it's designed in a manner that facilitates, the effect that it's meant to produce. So that's just a few general words on this topic, and they'll probably be relevant as we go further on as well. So I'll stop here for today. Vaishnavebhyo namo namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.